Is it now or never for the Miami Hurricanes? What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. And in today's episode, I'm going to be going into the Miami Hurricanes today, talking about the team that they have coming in this season and why this might be Mario Cristobal's last chance to win at his alma mater. But before I dive into things, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I post. Without further ado, though, let's get into this. And starting things out, the Miami Hurricanes come in once again, almost like most years, with top 25 expectations. They're projected by many to be in the top 25, maybe even top 20. Maybe even cracking the top 15 for some. But they're also a team that went just 7-6 last year. They had some head-scratching losses, most notably the one to Georgia Tech. I've talked about that one before. You've certainly heard about that one where they did not kneel the ball down when that was all they needed to do to win the game. And after that, they had a string of losses. And I'll actually maybe kind of get into that to get started here. So they started 4-0. They kind of benefited from a relatively easy schedule last year. Those wins came against Miami, Ohio. A good win over Texas A&M, a team who also disappointed, Bethune-Cookman, and then at Temple. So you start 4-0 with that. Expectations start building a little bit, especially with the win against A&M. And then things kind of unraveled and fell apart from there. They lose to Georgia Tech. They lose to North Carolina. They win. They get a big upset win over Clemson in double overtime, and then they get an overtime win over Virginia. And then the losses start to pile up again. North Carolina State, Florida State, both on the road. And then Louisville at home before beating Boston College to end the regular season and losing to Rutgers in the Pinstripe Bowl. Now, they didn't really have too many bad losses. And when I say bad, I mean blowout losses, because the Georgia Tech loss I would quantify as a bad loss, but that one was only by 3 points. North Carolina was a 10-point loss. NC State was 2 touchdowns, but then Florida State, Louisville, and Rutgers were all by exactly a touchdown each, touchdown and extra point. So those are all good losses in terms of the caliber of opponent. Maybe I would say the outlier there is the North Carolina loss by 10, but it's not like they got the brakes beat off of them in that one. And NC State by a couple of touchdowns as well. Those are probably the only two, but both of those teams are solid teams. This year, kind of staying with looking at the schedule first, I guess, and then we'll get into this team. They start at Florida. I think that's a little bit of a toss-up game. I think if it was not like Miami is a huge home field advantage, but if it was down in Miami, it'd be a little bit more. I'd lean towards the Hurricanes. That one's a bit of a toss-up. Then they get Florida A&M and Ball State at home, South Florida on the road, Virginia Tech at home, ACC newbies Cal all the way out in Berkeley, at Louisville, home against Florida State and Duke, at Georgia Tech, home against Wake Forest, and at Syracuse. Out of that schedule, there's probably only one game that I would say is almost a surefire loss, and that's Florida State. That game is at home. You never know what can happen. Again, I think Florida is a toss-up. I'm going to get into kind of wins and losses expectations, and so I'll circle around to this later. But that game at Louisville could be a really key game. I think maybe for both teams, but maybe especially for the Hurricanes. But before getting into all that, what I expect this team to do, let's get into what this team is going to look like. And I think in a preview of the Miami Hurricanes this season, it kind of has to start with quarterback Cam Ward transferring in from Washington State. The slinger from the Cougars really has burst onto the scene, I would say. He had a really good season last year and will lead a Hurricanes offense that, apart from that NC State game, did pretty well last year. They were held to 6 in that game. Offensively, they were 42nd nationally in passing, so that's, I would say good. It's not great. It's respectable, but it is good. It's in that top 50. Running the ball, they ranked 44th, and in total offense, they were actually 31st. So overall, a solid offense, not one that's gonna, just run up the score like an LSU offense last year, Ole Miss. But the Hurricanes also bring in running back Damien Martinez from Oregon State, who was a 1,000-yard rusher for the Beavers last year. So both of those two guys are two of the main additions on the offensive side of the ball. They also have wide receiver Xavier Restrepo, who had 85 receptions for just shy of 1,100 yards. Jacoby George had 8 touchdowns. And then sophomore Isaiah Horton is kind of one of the players to watch. Emerged a little bit last year and is expected to have an even bigger role. They also bring in wide receiver Sam Brown. On the offensive line, they bring in an experienced guy at center from Indiana, Zach Carpenter. And then on the offensive line, on the outsides, both tackle positions, they have a couple of really solid guys in left tackle Jalen Rivers and right tackle Francis Mauigoa. So this offense is a good unit. I think they have a chance to make strides this year. They have a couple good tight ends as well, Cam McCormick and Elijah Arroyo. And then they also have true freshmen who could avoid a red shirt and get a chance to play this year, Elijah Lofton. And Lofton is part of a top 5, the number 4 recruiting class in the country. This is a solid class. Some of the names that are in this are defensive tackle Justin Scott, edge rusher Marquise Lightfoot, another guy on the defensive line, Booker Pickett Jr., and then safety Zaquan Patterson, who will fill a void with some from DBs moving on either to the NFL or transferring. And I'll get into kind of that a little bit more, talking about the secondary, who they have coming back. A lot of these signs so far, we haven't even talked about really the defense yet. A lot of these signs point to the Hurricanes being a good unit, a good overall team, and an offensively, I think, a unit that could take some considerable strides. Cam Ward was at times a little bit in the Heisman discussion last year, and I think this Hurricanes offense has a chance to put up some pretty good numbers in the ACC this year. Quickly circling back to the schedule thing, because I mentioned the ACC, the Hurricanes also benefit from avoiding both Clemson and NC State, who I think are both teams that are probably ahead of them. The Hurricanes do get Florida State, but they get that game at home as well, and I think the rest of their schedule sets up nicely that if they lose that game to Florida State, they still have a really good shot at getting potentially into that 9-10 win territory, which is within range of a college football playoff berth. So now looking on the defensive side of the ball, and this unit actually might be even a little bit better. They ranked number 11 in the nation in rush defense and number 24 overall. Kind of starting things out, an emerging star, one that was highlighted by Athlon Sports as the emerging star, was Ruben Bain. You can already make the case, they say, he's emerged, but as the ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year last year, he had 7.5 sacks and 12.5 tackles for loss, which were second only to linebacker Francis Mauigoa's 18. He started in Game 3 last season and never relinquished that role as a true freshman for the Hurricanes, so he is potentially the player to watch on the defense. He's certainly one of their key players. And then they've also got defensive tackle Jared Harrison Hunty, who is also a player to watch there in kind of that second level of the defense. Mentioned already, Francisco Mauigoa, the linebacker. They've also got returning starter Wesley Bisanthe, I think is how you say that. Just going over a couple guys also on that defensive line. CJ Clark is the expected starter at defensive tackle. Marley Cook is another one there. And Akeem Mesidor on the other defensive end. So the linebacker core is also solid. I think that front 6 is actually how Miami runs it. 4 on the defensive line, 2 linebackers, and then a nickelback is how they're projected to start. Were really good against the rush last year, and I think that can be expected to continue, even though they only have 3 out of those 6 starters returning this year. Looking at the DBs then, looking at that secondary, I think a really key and maybe an underrated addition in terms of not like so much in terms of who Miami added this year, but in the conference and maybe even nationally, is Mishael Powell, from Washington. He was a key part of the Huskies defense that got obviously to the national championship game. He's expected to slide into that nickelback role for the Hurricanes. I think that's a really good pickup that maybe went a little bit under the radar for Miami. I think he'll boost that defense, and he has a lot of experience. He has winning experience. Most importantly, I think that'll be an important addition for the Hurricanes secondary, which wasn't bad last year, but it certainly lagged behind the rush defense. They ranked 55th with exactly 216 yards per game allowed. Kind of brought down the defense to overall ranking 24th in total defense, which is certainly solid. So you're still top 25 there. But another thing that maybe is more important, because you look at this yardage, and I think the better correlation sometimes versus national rankings can be a little bit skewed, because maybe you play in a conference that gives up a lot of either passing or rushing yards. If you play in like the Big Ten West, your rush yards are probably going to be a little bit higher, your rush yards allowed, versus really throughout a lot of the rest of the college football, the passing numbers are going to be up. I think what's a little bit more of a key factor, though, is the discrepancy between yards allowed and scoring, because I think even more importantly than allowing yards is what are you giving up on the scoreboard. And the Hurricanes ranked 42nd with just a tick under 23 points per game allowed last year. I think if you can, even if you give up yards, even if you give up a lot of yards, if you're holding teams to field goals, I think that's important. The Hurricanes show that they're kind of middle of the road. If they can maybe improve on that, a little bit better red zone defense this year. I'll see if I can pop up some of the stats that they had last year in the red zone. If they can get a little bit better at stopping teams from scoring touchdowns and maybe forcing a turnover, things like that. Actually, in turnover margin also, this is kind of on that point. They were 94th nationally, and obviously I'm sure they're tied with a lot of teams with -4. That's something that if that can improve, and it could be improved also by having a just poised quarterback back there in Cam Ward, who's not you wouldn't expect going to throw a lot of interceptions. So I think those are two key areas to watch. Again, kind of middle of the road in that scoring defense. Not bad. I would say a little bit more leaning towards good, because they're in that top 50, top 45. But the turnover margin is something that can be improved. If you improve both of those things, this defense could be really good, because they do well against the rush. I think Mishael Powell will be a big addition for that secondary to help improve their defense against the pass, and I think that's probably a big part of why he was brought to Coral Gables. Looking at a couple of those other guys in the secondary, Darrell Porter Jr. is the returning starter at cornerback. He'll be joined by Damari Brown at the other cornerback position, safety Jaden Harris, and then outside of that, they also bring in, mentioned these guys on the defensive line, the names that I mentioned, C.J. Clark and Marley Cook are a couple of other transfer additions. Clark from NC State and Cook from Middle Tennessee. I think those are a couple of good additions. They're not like wow factor additions, but I think they're solid, and I think they'll, again, improve this Miami defense. I don't expect anything like a jump of Ohio State, for example, the defensive struggles that they had bringing in Jim Knowles and then getting up to one of the best defenses in the country, and even statistically ranking as the best in some areas. So I don't expect that level of transformation. Their defensive coordinator is Lance Guidry. That's not a name that's going to ring a lot of bells for people. Honestly, frankly, it doesn't for me. But I think the Hurricanes, if they can make progress on the defensive side of the ball, I think they can threaten to win the ACC potentially. I think with a lot of the losses that Florida State has, I think they're still the top dogs in the conference. I think Clemson, if I were to kind of boil down what I expect in the ACC, I expect Florida State to take a slight step down. I don't expect them to have the level of drop-off that we might see from Washington this year. And Washington, I think, is a team that people need to be careful not to count out completely. I think they're still going to be good this year. I think Florida State might take a slight step down. I think Clemson is improving. They showed that at the back stretch of last season. So I think they're going to kind of catch up a little bit. I think NC State is a little bit on the rise too. And then I think Miami can be in that group. I think this is a very competitive top 4 in the ACC, and Miami is going to be counted amongst that group. The fact that they don't have to play against NC State or Clemson, as I mentioned earlier, benefits them hugely. I think it is a challenge that they get 2 Florida opponents on the road. I don't think South Florida will be that difficult, but Alabama had issues in Tampa last year, so you never know. And Alabama's going through a bunch in that game, but still. Florida in the Swamp, week 1 of this season. It's such a toss-up. I'm leaning Florida right now, so that would probably mean 2 losses. I think the Hurricanes are still just behind Florida State, but they might take that leap. I think they have the potential to take that leap ahead of the Seminoles. And outside of that, I mentioned I was going to get to this one later. I think Louisville is just outside that top 4, but playing that game at Cardinal Stadium will be tough. I think you also have to be really careful coming back from a road trip out to Cal, and then you coming back for that road game against Louisville. So you're maybe going back to Miami probably, and then you're going out to Louisville, and then you have, don't want to get caught looking ahead to that FSU game. I think that's a really important game. I think outside of that Louisville game, I think the Hurricanes are probably 9-2. And so I know this isn't like a last game of the season type thing like the one at Syracuse where they're technically, maybe 8-3 or 9-2 at that point and playing for, a spot maybe in the ACC championship game. And honestly, with the way I project it right now, I project a loss to Florida on the road in the Swamp, and I think the Gators are going to improve this year. I talked about it actually in my last video. Their schedule is just so loaded. It's going to be really tough to be better than even 7-5, and I think that's almost their ceiling this year because of their schedule. I think they win the next 5 games heading into that game at Louisville. I think that is the key one because I think they probably lose to Florida State. Duke will be tough too, but that one's nice to be home. At Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, and Syracuse, I think those are all wins. Home against Wake Forest out of those 3. So again, you're sitting at 9-2, and really this season, I think, especially for teams outside the Big Ten and SEC, I think it's possible we could see a Big Ten or SEC team get into the playoff with 3 losses. I don't see that happening out of the ACC or the Big 12. So I think Miami, if they win this game, first of all, their only loss in conference play is to Florida State, so they're probably playing the Seminoles again, either them or Clemson, depending on how that matchup goes. And they're probably, with a win against Louisville in the college football playoff, I would say that I think they win that game. So I think the Hurricanes are 10-2. And then I think they're in a pretty tough position because you're 10-2 with the schedule that they have. They're not going to really be able to pick up a lot of ranked wins. Really, Florida State and maybe Louisville. Virginia Tech could take some strides, and if they have a good start to the year, could be ranked. But they're not going to have a lot of ranked wins, so they're probably going to be sitting right around that 10, 11, 12 range heading into the ACC championship game if how I project their season to go is how it ends up. So that's a tough position because, it's almost like you'd rather not play that game because if you don't play it, you're in for sure. And if you play it and lose, then you're probably out. And if you win, obviously, then you're in as the ACC champ and you're playing for a conference championship. So it's not like they'll have a lack for motivation, but kind of have rambled on to the end of this video. I think it's fun where we're at in this time of college football where we are just about, as this video is going to be posted, we're like 2 months away, 2 months and I think 2 days from the start of the college football season when Florida State takes on Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland. So there's going to be a lot. Trust me, there's going to be a lot. I've actually, this last week, been covering the College World Series here in Omaha. It's been a fantastic, phenomenal opportunity. I know this probably isn't the channel for it, but I might make some sort of video somewhere on my social media, just kind of detailing my experience with that. So I haven't had as much time to make these videos, but the next week and kind of coming weeks, I'll have more opportunities to really dive into these previews. Kind of my next one, maybe a little bit more of like a profile feature-y type like story one. I'm going to be talking about the Arizona connection of Noah Fifita and Totoiroa McMillan, quarterback wide receiver tandem that I think is going to have the Wildcats well positioned in the Big 12 this year. But that's all for this video. Let me know your thoughts on Miami. Let me know what you think their record is going to be this year. If you think they will make either the ACC championship game and or the college football playoff, and how you think the ACC is going to shape up this year. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett, signing out. Peace.